Every day the black girl returned from school with half her lunch uneaten. When her exhausted father discovered the real reason, his hands began to shake. The lunchbox hit the kitchen counter with a hollow thud. Sarah Johnson, 8 years old with braids tied in pink ribbons, pushed it away without looking at her father. Half a sandwich, an untouched apple, and crackers still wrapped in plastic sat inside. Robert Johnson's fingers tightened around the dish towel he was holding. Third day this week. His daughter's lunchbox kept coming back half full, and the circles under her eyes kept getting darker. Sarah. He kept his voice steady, the same tone he used with anxious patients during his night shifts at Sacramento General. Did you eat today? Sarah shrugged, her backpack sliding off one shoulder. I wasn't hungry. The kitchen clock read 3:45 p.m. Robert's shoulders ached from his 12-hour shift that had ended just 2 hours ago. Empty coffee cups lined the sink, testament to his struggle to stay awake. Baby girl, you need to eat. He pulled out a kitchen chair. The legs scraped against the linoleum floor. Come sit with me for a minute. Sarah's sneakers squeaked as she dragged her feet to the table. Her pink t-shirt was wrinkled, and a small stain marked the collar. Robert made a mental note to do laundry before his next shift. What's going on at school? He leaned forward, trying to catch her eye. Mrs. Martinez said you seemed quiet when she picked you up. Nothing. Sarah picked at a loose thread on her jeans. Can I go to my room? I have homework. Robert's phone buzzed in his pocket. Another text from the hospital asking if he could cover an extra shift. His bank account was running low, and Sarah needed new shoes. The old ones were starting to pinch her toes. Okay. He pushed back from the table. But we're talking about this at dinner? Sarah bolted from the kitchen. Her footsteps thundered up the stairs, followed by the sharp click of her bedroom door. Robert opened the fridge. A half-gallon of milk, some eggs, and leftover spaghetti stared back at him. The grocery money would have to wait until payday. He pulled out his phone, deleted the hospital's message without responding. The evening dragged on. Robert dozed on the couch while Sarah did her homework upstairs. The TV murmured in the background, some game show where people won more money in 30 minutes than he made in 3 months. At 6:30, he reheated the spaghetti. Sarah picked at her food, pushing the noodles around her plate. Your teacher sent another note home. Robert watched her fork stop mid-twirl. Said you were late turning in your math homework again. I forgot it at home. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. That's the 3rd time this month. Robert rubbed his eyes. What's really going on, Sarah? You used to love school. Sarah's lower lip trembled. She opened her mouth, closed it again. The kitchen light flickered, casting shadows across her face. I'm tired. She pushed her plate away. Can I go to bed? Robert checked his watch. 7:15 p.m. Too early for bed, but he recognized the escape tactic. He'd used it himself enough times. All right. He stood, joints popping. But first, a scream cut through the house. Sarah thrashed in her bed, tangled in pink sheets decorated with unicorns. Robert sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Mama! Sarah's voice cracked. Don't go! Robert gathered her into his arms. Her pajamas were damp with sweat, her braids coming undone. I'm here, baby. He rocked her gently. Daddy's here. Sarah's eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. Recognition slowly dawned, followed by embarrassment. She pulled away, wiping her face. Same dream? Robert asked softly. Sarah nodded. 3 years since Monica left, and the nightmares still came. She's not coming back, is she? Sarah's voice was small, muffled against his shirt. Robert's throat tightened. No, baby. But I'm not going anywhere. Promise. They sat in silence, the moonlight casting shadows through the window. Sarah's breathing slowly steadied. Robert's back ached from the awkward position, but he didn't move. When Sarah finally drifted off, Robert tucked her in and crept downstairs. In the kitchen, he opened her lunchbox again. Something crinkled in the front pocket. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, smoothed it flat on the counter. A crude drawing showed a stick figure with brown skin standing alone, surrounded by other figures pointing and laughing. Words scrawled in childish handwriting made his hands shake. Go back where you came from. Robert sank into a kitchen chair, the paper crinkling in his fist. The clock ticked past midnight. In 6 hours, he'd have to get up and do it all again. Pack another lunch that would come home half-eaten. send his daughter back to a school where someone had put this note in her lunchbox. His phone buzzed again. Another hospital request. This time, he typed yes. The extra shift would mean more money, maybe enough for those new shoes. But as he headed upstairs to catch a few hours of sleep, the crumpled drawing weighed heavy in his pocket. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to fix this. For now, the night shift called, and Sarah needed new shoes. The emergency room buzzed with fluorescent lights and beeping monitors. Robert Johnson's scrub stuck to his back as he finished changing in 4-bag. 4 hours into his shift, and the waiting room was still packed. Johnson, Dr. Martinez's voice cut through the noise. Got another one for you in bed 3. Robert nodded, checking his watch. 2:47 a.m. In 4 hours, he'd need to be home getting Sarah ready for school. His muscles ached from standing, but there was no time to rest. The patient in bed 3 had a nasty cut that needed stitches. As Robert cleaned the wound, his phone vibrated. A text from Mrs. Martinez, his elderly neighbor. Sarah had another nightmare. She's settled now. Don't worry. His hand stayed steady as he placed the stitches, but his mind raced. 2 nightmares in one night. That hadn't happened since the first months after Monica left. You're good at this. The patient mumbled through the pain medication. Got kids? 1. Robert secured the last stitch. 8 years old. Must be hard. Working nights? Robert just smiled, the professional smile he'd perfected over years of deflecting personal questions. Inside, his stomach churned. The parent-teacher conference he'd missed yesterday would have consequences. The rest of his shift blurred together. More patients, more charts, more worried faces under harsh lights. At 6:15 a.m., he clocked out, his scrubs spattered with other people's blood and pain. The drive home took 12 minutes. Robert counted each one, knowing Sarah would wake up at 6:45 for school. As he pulled into the driveway, Mrs. Martinez was already waiting on her porch next door, wrapped in a faded blue robe. She had a rough night, Mrs. Martinez said, following him inside. Her arthritis-twisted hands clutched a coffee mug. Kept asking for her mama. Robert's key stuck in the lock, like it always did. I'm sorry about calling so late. Don't be silly. Mrs. Martinez patted his arm. That's what neighbors are for. Upstairs, Sarah's bedroom door stood half open. Pink curtains fluttered in the morning breeze. Robert's throat tightened at the sight of her curled up small beneath her unicorn blanket, one braid completely undone. Sarah. He touched her shoulder gently. Time to wake up, baby girl. Sarah's eyes opened, then immediately squeezed shut. I don't feel good. Robert pressed his palm to her forehead. No fever. What hurts? My stomach. Sarah pulled the blanket higher. Can I stay home? The parent-teacher conference he'd missed flashed through his mind. Another absence would only make things worse. Nice try. He kept his voice light. But you need to go to school? Sarah's face crumpled. Please, Daddy. I really don't feel good. I made pancakes. Mrs. Martinez called from downstairs. The smell of butter and syrup wafted up, a peace offering. Sarah didn't move. Robert checked his watch again. 6:52 a.m. They were already running late. 5 minutes. He stood up, joints popping. Then you need to get dressed. In the kitchen, Mrs. Martinez was pouring syrup over a stack of pancakes. She's getting worse, Robert. Something's wrong at that school. Robert slumped into a chair. I know, but I can't. His voice cracked. I can't fix it if she won't talk to me. And you can't fix it if you're working yourself to death. Mrs. Martinez set a coffee mug in front of him. When's the last time you slept more than 3 hours? Before he could answer, Sarah appeared in the doorway. Her school uniform was wrinkled, and she'd only managed to braid one side of her hair. Come here. Robert patted his lap. Let me fix those braids. Sarah shuffled over, shoulders hunched. As Robert worked on her hair, Mrs. Martinez slid a plate of pancakes in front of her. Sarah picked up her fork, then set it down without taking a bite. The school called yesterday, Mrs. Martinez said carefully. While you were sleeping, they want to schedule another meeting. Robert's fingers fumbled with the hair elastic. When? Next Tuesday. 9 a.m. Sarah went rigid in his lap. Robert closed his eyes briefly. Tuesday morning meant missing another shift, meant explaining to his supervisor again why he needed time off. I'll figure it out. He finished the braid, kissed Sarah's head. Eat your pancakes, baby. We're running late. Sarah pushed the plate away. I'm not hungry. The clock read 7:15 a.m. School started at 7:45, and they still needed to drive across town. Robert's exhaustion turned to frustration. Sarah, his voice came out sharper than intended. You need to eat. I said I'm not hungry. Sarah jumped up, knocking her fork to the floor. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Mrs. Martinez moved faster than her arthritis should have allowed, wrapping Sarah in a hug. Shamajita, it's okay. Robert's phone buzzed. A text from the school secretary. Reminder, third tardy this month will result in detention. We have to go. He grabbed Sarah's backpack, started packing her lunch with shaking hands. Sandwich, apple, crackers. Just like yesterday. Just like every day. Sarah's sobs quieted to hiccups. Mrs. Martinez whispered something in Spanish, stroking her hair. Robert felt like he was moving underwater, his exhaustion making everything slow and heavy. The drive to school was silent. Sarah stared out the window, clutching her backpack. Robert's eyes burned from lack of sleep. At a red light, he noticed Sarah's shoelaces were untied. They pulled up to the school at 7:50 a.m. 5 minutes late. Again. Have a good day? Robert's voice sounded hollow. I love you. Sarah didn't answer. She slipped out of the car and walked toward the building, her untied shoelaces trailing behind her. Through the windshield, Robert watched her disappear into a sea of other children, most of them wearing newer uniforms, carrying better backpacks. His phone buzzed again. The hospital supervisor. Need to discuss your recent schedule changes. Meeting today at 2 p.m. Robert rested his forehead against the steering wheel. In his pocket, the crumpled drawing from Sarah's lunchbox felt like it was burning a hole. The school secretary emerged from the building, clipboard in hand. She was walking toward his car with purpose. Robert started the engine. He couldn't deal with another conversation about tardiness. Not now. Not when he hadn't slept in 20 hours and his daughter was falling apart and everything was spinning out of control. As he pulled away from the curb, he caught a glimpse of Sarah through a classroom window. She was sitting alone at the back of the room, her half-braided hair hiding her face. The sight followed him home, where he collapsed in a bed fully dressed, too exhausted even to cry. His last thought before sleep took him was of Sarah's untied shoelaces, dragging behind her like surrender flags. Robert woke to pounding on his front door. The bedroom was dark. He'd slept through the entire day. His phone showed 6 missed calls from the hospital and 1 text from the school. Emergency. Please contact immediately. His heart stopped. Sarah. He stumbled down the stairs, still in his wrinkled scrubs from the morning shift. Mrs. Martinez stood on his porch, holding Sarah's backpack. She's upstairs, Mrs. Martinez said before he could speak. In her room. Robert, she was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Sarah's door was closed. No light showing underneath. Sarah? He knocked softly. Baby girl? A muffled sob answered him. Robert pushed the door open. Sarah lay curled on her bed, still in her school uniform. Her shoulders shook with silent tears. When Robert flicked on the light, he saw her knees were scraped raw, her uniform skirt torn at the hem. What happened? He knelt beside the bed. Who did this? Sarah buried her face deeper in her pillow. I fell. Don't lie to me. Robert's voice cracked. Please, Sarah. Talk to me. Mrs. Martinez appeared in the doorway, clutching a piece of paper. The school found this in her desk. Robert took the paper. A report card. All C's and D's, with 1 F in math. Sarah had always been an A student. His hands started shaking. They pushed me. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. During recess. Said I didn't belong there. The room went very quiet. Robert could hear his own heartbeat, too fast and too loud. Who pushed you? The big kids. Sarah hiccuped. They said. She dissolved into fresh tears. Robert gathered her into his arms, feeling her whole body trembling. The school called a meeting, Mrs. Martinez said from the doorway. Tomorrow morning at 8. They're threatening suspension for the forged signature on her last progress report. Robert's head snapped up. What forged signature? Sarah went rigid in his arms slowly. She reached under her mattress and pulled out a crumpled envelope. Inside was another report card, dated 2 weeks ago. At the bottom, a shaky attempt at Robert's signature. I didn't want you to worry. Sarah's voice was small. You were so tired, and I thought I could fix it. Robert stared at the forged signature. His vision blurred. Why didn't you tell me about the grades? Because... Sarah pulled away from him. You're always working and always tired, and I didn't want to make it worse. Her shout echoed in the small room. Mrs. Martinez stepped back, murmuring something about making tea. Sarah. Robert reached for her, but she flinched away. I hate that school. The words exploded out of her. Everyone looks at us funny because we're the only black family and my uniform's old and she choked on a sob. I want Mama. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert felt like he'd been punched in the chest. His phone buzzed. The hospital supervisor. Final warning. Missed meeting today. Position in jeopardy. Robert threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a crack, the screen going dark. I'm sorry. Sarah's voice was tiny. I'm sorry, Daddy. Please don't be mad. I'm not mad at you. Robert pulled her close again. I'm mad at myself. I should have seen. I should have known. A car door slammed outside. Through the window, Robert saw a white SUV with the school district logo pull into his driveway. Mr. Johnson? A woman's voice called from downstairs. This is Principal Edwards. We need to discuss Sarah's situation immediately. Sarah started shaking again. Robert looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. Her uniform was 2 sizes too small. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. One of her braids was completely undone, the pink ribbon trailing on the floor. Please don't make me go back. Sarah clutched his shirt. Please, Daddy. Footsteps on the stairs. Principal Edwards appeared in the doorway, her blazer pristine, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. Mr. Johnson. Her voice was clipped. We've been trying to reach you all day. This situation with Sarah has become untenable. The forged signature alone is grounds for. Get out. Robert's voice was very quiet. Principal Edwards blinked. Excuse me? Get out of my house. He stood slowly, Sarah still in his arms now. Mr. Johnson, be reasonable. Sarah's behavior. My daughter was assaulted on your playground. Robert's voice shook with fury. She's being bullied, her grades are dropping, and your response is to threaten suspension? There's no evidence of... Look at her knees. Robert's shout made everyone jump. Look at her uniform. Look at my baby girl crying because she's scared to go to school. And tell me there's no evidence. Principal Edwards took a step back. If you continue this aggressive behavior, I'll have to. You'll have to what? Robert advanced toward her. Call the police? Tell them the big scary black man raised his voice when his 8-year-old daughter came home beaten up. Daddy. Sarah tugged his sleeve. You're scaring me? The words hit him like ice water. Robert forced his hands to unclench. We're done here. He turned his back on Principal Edwards. Sarah won't be returning to your school. Send her records wherever you need to. No, get out of my house. This is highly irregular. Out. Principal Edwards retreated, her heels clicking rapidly down the stairs. The front door slammed. Through the window, Robert watched her SUV peel out of the driveway. His phone lay face down by the wall, screen shattered. The hospital would be calling again soon, demanding explanations. His shift started in 4 hours. Sarah needed new shoes, new uniforms, and new school. Everything was falling apart. What are we going to do? Sarah's voice was small against his chest. Robert sank on her bed, still holding her close. The torn report card lay crumpled on the floor. Outside, Mrs. Martinez's screen door creaked open and closed. I don't know, baby girl. He pressed his face into her hair. I don't know. The sun set behind the window, casting long shadows across the room. Sarah's breathing eventually steadied, but Robert stayed awake, staring at nothing. His whole body ached with exhaustion, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. Something had to change. He just didn't know what or how. Robert sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers. School registration forms, transfer requests, and medical records spread across the scratched surface. His work uniform lay crumpled on a chair, unworn. He called in sick for the first time in 3 years. Here? Mrs. Martinez set a cup of coffee in front of him. Sarah's still sleeping. It was 10 a.m. After Principal Edwards left yesterday, Sarah had cried herself to sleep. Robert hadn't had the heart to wake her for school this morning. His shattered phone buzzed. The screen was cracked, but he could still read the message from his supervisor. Final warning. Termination pending. You need to tell them, Mrs. Martinez said, sitting across from him. About Sarah. About everything. Robert rubbed his eyes. Tell who? The school board? The hospital? They don't want to hear. Daddy? Sarah stood in the doorway, still in her pajamas. Her hair was a mess of unbraided tangles, her eyes puffy from crying. Come here, baby. Robert pushed back from the table. Opening his arms, Sarah shuffled over, climbed into his lap. She felt smaller than usual, fragile. We need to talk. Robert kept his voice gentle. About everything that's been happening at school. Sarah stiffened. Mrs. Martinez quietly stood and left the kitchen, her slippers shuffling against the linoleum. I don't want to. I know. Robert stroked her hair. But I can't help if I don't know what's wrong. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. They call me names? Who does? The other kids. Mostly the fifth graders. Sarah picked at a loose thread on her pajama sleeve. They say I only got in because the school needs to look diverse. Robert's hands started shaking. What else? They take my lunch sometimes. Or put notes in it. Sarah's voice got even smaller. About how we don't belong there. How we're too poor. How? She hiccuped. How I don't have a mom because she didn't want a kid like me. The kitchen went very still. Robert could hear the clock ticking, each second like a hammer blow. Why didn't you tell me? He managed to keep his voice steady. Because you were already so tired. Sarah's lower lip trembled. And when I tried to tell Mrs. Wilson, she said I needed to toughen up. That kids just say mean things sometimes. Your teacher said that? Sarah nodded. She told me to stop being so sensitive. That's why. She swallowed hard. That's why I stopped doing my homework. What's the point if she thinks I'm just making excuses? Robert's coffee grew cold on the table. Outside, a lawnmower droned. Normal sounds on a normal morning, while his world cracked apart. Show me? Sarah slid off his lap, disappeared upstairs. She came back with her backpack, unzipped the front pocket. Crumpled papers cascaded onto the table. Robert smoothed them flat, one by one. Crude drawings. Racial slurs his 8-year-old shouldn't know. Threats written in childish handwriting. They said if I told anyone, Sarah's voice cracked. They said they'd hurt Jessica too. Who's Jessica? My only friend. Sarah wiped her eyes. She's Korean. They're mean to her too, but not as much as me. I've been giving her half my lunch, because they take her sometimes. The pieces clicked into place. The half-empty lunchbox. The falling grades. The morning stomach aches. Robert's phone buzzed again. The hospital. He ignored it. What happened yesterday? He pulled Sarah back into his lap. With your knees? Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. Tommy and his friends cornered us at recess. They pushed me down, said we were charity cases. That's when they ripped my skirt. And the teachers? Mrs. Wilson was on duty. She saw, but... Sarah hiccuped. She said we must have been running where we shouldn't. Robert's vision went red around the edges. Did they hurt Jessica too? Sarah shook her head. She ran to get help. That's why they hate me more now. Because I told her to run. Pride and pain warred in Robert's chest. His daughter protecting her friend. His baby girl bearing this alone for months. I'm so sorry. His voice cracked. I should have known. Should have seen. Are you mad at me? No, baby. Robert hugged her tight. I'm mad at them. At the teachers who didn't protect you. At myself for not seeing how bad it was. I don't want to go back. Sarah buried her face in his shirt. Please don't make me go back. Never. Robert kissed the top of her head. You're never going back there. His phone buzzed one final time. Without looking, he knew it was the hospital. His career hanging by a thread because he couldn't balance everything, couldn't be everywhere at once. Sarah's stomach growled. Robert realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch. How about pancakes? He stood, setting her gently in a chair. Extra syrup? For the first time in weeks, Sarah's face brightened slightly. Can we have bacon too? Of course. Robert opened the fridge, grateful he'd gone grocery shopping last week. And after breakfast, we're going to write everything down. Every name, every incident. Then we're going to the school board. Sarah's smile faded. But what if they don't believe me? They'll believe the pictures. Robert pulled out his cracked phone. I took photos of your knees last night. And we have all these notes. What about Jessica? Sarah twisted her hands together. I promised I'd protect her. We'll protect her too. Robert cracked eggs into a bowl, his movements precise and controlled, like prepping medical supplies, focusing on the task to keep from screaming. But first, breakfast. As he cooked, Sarah stayed quiet, watching him with tired eyes. The morning sun streamed through the window, highlighting the tear tracks on her cheeks. Mrs. Martinez's screen door creaked. Through the window, Robert saw her heading toward her car, a determined set to her shoulders. She caught his eye, pointed to her phone, mouthed school board. Robert nodded. The bacon sizzled, filling the kitchen with warmth and familiar smells. Sarah's shoulders slowly relaxed. His phone buzzed one last time, then went dark. Battery dead. Like his career, probably. But watching his daughter finally eat, seeing the first hint of peace on her face in weeks, Robert couldn't bring himself to care. Some things were more important than a job. Some battles couldn't wait. Daddy? Sarah's voice was muffled around a mouthful of pancake. Yeah, baby? I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Robert set a plate of bacon on the table. You have nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. Sarah nodded, but her eyes were still uncertain. Robert sat down beside her, his own breakfast untouched. The morning stretched ahead, full of phone calls to make, battles to fight. But right now, watching his daughter eat pancakes in their sun-filled kitchen, Robert felt something he hadn't in weeks. Hope. The hospital corridors stretched endless and white under fluorescent lights. Robert stood outside his supervisor's office, his wrinkled scrubs still smelling like pancake syrup from breakfast. The nameplate on the door read Margaret Chun, head of nursing. His newly replaced phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Martinez, school board meeting in 1 hour. Where are you? Robert checked his watch. 8:45 a.m. He'd promised Sarah he'd be there for the meeting, but Margaret had been clear. Come now or don't come back at all. The office door opened. Come in, Johnson. Margaret sat behind her desk, a stack of attendance reports in front of her. Her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, catching the harsh office light. Sit. Robert sank into the hard plastic chair. His bones ached from nights of broken sleep. 3 missed shifts. Margaret tapped the reports. 2 missed mandatory meetings. Multiple schedule change requests. Care to explain? My daughter is having trouble at school. Yes, I know. Margaret's voice softened slightly. Robert, you're one of our best nurses, but we need reliability. I'm reliable. The words came out sharper than intended. I've covered holiday shifts, stayed late, picked up extra. In the past, yes. Margaret leaned forward. But lately, the other nurses are complaining. Patients are asking where you are. We can't. Robert's phone buzzed again. Mrs. Martinez, Sarah's asking for you. I need to go. He stood abruptly. My daughter. If you walk out that door, Margaret's voice turned hard. Don't bother coming back. Robert's hands clenched. Are you firing me? I'm giving you a choice. Margaret removed her glasses. Stay, discuss a plan to get back on track, or leave and find another job. Your choice. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 8:52 a.m. My daughter was assaulted at school. Robert's voice shook. They pushed her down, tore her clothes, called her names. And you want me to choose between her and this job? Margaret's face softened. No one's asking you to choose. That's exactly what you're asking. The words exploded out of him. My 8-year-old is being bullied because she's black, because she's poor, because her mother left. She needs me there today, not here discussing attendance reports. Lower your voice. Margaret glanced at the door. Let's be professional about this. Professional? Robert laughed, a harsh sound. You want professional? I've worked here 3 years. Never called in sick until yesterday. Covered every emergency shift you needed. And now that I need flexibility, his phone buzzed a third time. A photo from Mrs. Martinez. Sarah sitting in the school board office, her shoulders hunched, looking small in the oversized chair. I quit. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret blinked. Don't be hasty. Think about your benefits, your pension. My daughter needs me. Robert turned toward the door. That's all I need to think about. Robert, wait. But he was already moving, striding down the endless white corridor. Nurses and patients turned to stare as he passed. His hands shook as he punched the elevator button. The drive to the school board office took 20 minutes. Every red light felt like an eternity. His phone kept buzzing, Margaret probably trying to talk sense into him. He ignored it. The parking lot was full when he arrived. Parents, teachers, administrators crowded the small building. Robert spotted Mrs. Martinez's car and pulled in beside it. Inside, voices echoed off institutional walls. Robert followed the sound to a conference room. Through the window, he saw Sarah sitting between Mrs. Martinez and a woman he didn't recognize. An Asian woman sat nearby with a girl about Sarah's age, Jessica, he realized. Daddy! Sarah's face lit up when he pushed through the door. She launched herself into his arms. I'm sorry I'm late. He hugged her tight. But I'm here now. Mr. Johnson, a man in a suit stood from the conference table. I'm Director Williams. We were just reviewing the evidence. Evidence? Robert's voice was hard. You mean these? He pulled out his phone, showed the photos of Sarah's scraped knees, her torn uniform. Then the stack of notes, the cruel drawings, the threats. Mrs. Wilson claimed she saw no indication of bullying. Another board member said. Mrs. Wilson saw everything. Jessica's mother spoke up, her accent thick with anger. My daughter told me. She saw and did nothing. Sarah pressed closer to Robert's side. He could feel her trembling. Perhaps if Mr. Johnson had attended more parent-teacher conferences, Principal Edwards started. Don't. Robert's voice could have frozen fire. Don't you dare try to blame this on my work schedule. Your teacher saw my daughter being bullied and did nothing. Your staff ignored racist harassment. And now you want to discuss my attendance? The room went very quiet. Director Williams cleared his throat. These are serious accusations. They're not accusations. Mrs. Martinez stood, her arthritis forgotten in anger. They're facts. I have dozens of photos. Times, dates, witnesses. The police are very interested. The police? Principal Edwards paled. Yes. Jessica's mother pulled out her own phone. I filed a report yesterday. Assault on minors. Hate crime. The board members exchanged glances. Robert held Sarah closer. We'll need time to investigate, Director Williams began. No. Robert's voice filled the room. You've had time. Months of time. While my daughter suffered. While her grades dropped. While she cried herself to sleep. No more time. What exactly do you want, Mr. Johnson? I want Mrs. Wilson fired. Robert's voice was steady now. I want those kids suspended. I want a full investigation into your staff's handling of racial harassment. And I want it in writing today. That's not how these things. Either you handle this, Robert cut in, or the media does. Your choice. Another silence. Director Williams tugged at his tie. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No. Sarah's voice was small but clear. I want to stay. People need to know. Robert looked down at his daughter, saw the determination beneath her fear. Pride swelled in his chest. All right. Director Williams sank back into his chair. Let's start from the beginning. For the next 2 hours, they talked. Sarah and Jessica described every incident. Their mothers produced evidence, photos, notes, emails to teachers that went unanswered. Mrs. Martinez detailed what she'd witnessed in the pickup line. Robert stood through it all, holding Sarah when she cried, squeezing her hand when her voice shook. His phone stayed silent in his pocket. The hospital, his job, his career, none of it mattered right now. Finally, Director Williams closed his notebook. We'll have a formal response by end of day. He looked tired. In the meantime, Mrs. Wilson is suspended pending investigation. The students involved will face disciplinary action. And Sarah and Jessica's absences? Robert asked. We'll be excused, of course. Director Williams stood. Mr. Johnson, I apologize. We failed your daughter. Sarah's grip on Robert's hand tightened. Outside, the sun was setting. They'd been there all day. As they walked to the car, Sarah looked up at him. Did you get in trouble at work? Robert lifted her into his arms, ignoring his aching back. Don't worry about that. We're going to be okay. But your job, Some things are more important than a job. He buckled her into the back seat, like making sure my baby girl is safe and happy. In the rearview mirror, he watched Sarah lean her head against the window. Her eyes were tired, but the fear was gone. His phone buzzed one last time. Margaret, position still open if you reconsider. Night shift only. Robert deleted the message without responding. The night shift had cost him too much already. They drove home in silence, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of promise. A week after the school board meeting, Robert sat in his car outside Sacramento East Elementary. The building looked different from this new parking spot, smaller, less intimidating. Sarah clutched her new backpack in the back seat. You sure about this? Robert checked the rearview mirror. We could try another school? Sarah shook her head. Jessica's here. And Mrs. Martinez says the new teacher is nice. The new teacher. After the investigation, Mrs. Wilson had resigned. Principal Edwards was on administrative leave. The local news had run a story about systemic issues in the district. Daddy. Sarah's voice was small. Will you walk me in? Robert checked his watch. 7:30 a.m. His interview at the local clinic wasn't until 9 o'clock. Of course, baby. The school hallways felt different too. Students and teachers smiled as they passed. A security guard nodded respectfully. Sarah's new classroom was bright, with student artwork covering the walls. Good morning, Sarah. A young woman with kind eyes approached them. I'm Ms. Thompson. Sarah half hid behind Robert's leg. Hi. We're so happy to have you back. Ms. Thompson knelt to Sarah's level. Jessica saved you a seat by the window. Jessica waved from across the room. Her mother stood nearby, watching carefully. Mr. Johnson? Ms. Thompson stood. Could we talk for a moment? Robert tensed, but her smile remained gentle. They stepped into the hallway. I wanted to tell you personally, Ms. Thompson said. We've implemented new anti-bullying protocols. And I've spoken with both Sarah and Jessica's former classmates. The ones who... Robert's hands clenched. They're in mandatory counseling now. Ms. Thompson touched his arm lightly. And they wrote these. She handed him a stack of papers. Apology letters written in clumsy child handwriting. I'm not showing these to Sarah unless you approve. Ms. Thompson's voice was soft. But I thought you should know. Your daughter's story changed things. Not just here, but district-wide. Robert's throat tightened. Through the classroom window, he watched Sarah settle into her new seat. Jessica immediately showed her something in a book, making them both giggle. There's something else you should know. Ms. Thompson pulled out her phone, showed him a photo. This is from last month. The image showed the school cafeteria. In the background, Sarah sat with Jessica. They were splitting a sandwich. At first, we thought Sarah wasn't eating her lunch. Ms. Thompson's voice caught. Then we realized she was sharing it. Every day. With other kids who couldn't afford lunch. Robert stared at the photo. His daughter, who had so little, giving half of what she had. Not just Jessica. His voice was rough. Ms. Thompson shook her head. There were at least 3 others. Kids from low-income families. Sarah would pretend she wasn't hungry, so they wouldn't feel bad about taking her food. The half-empty lunchbox. The weight loss. The excuses. Why didn't anyone? Robert stopped, remembering the overworked teachers, the overwhelmed staff. We failed these children. Ms. Thompson's eyes were bright. But Sarah, she saw what we missed. She helped when we didn't. Inside the classroom, Sarah was showing Jessica her new pencil case. Their heads bent together, whispering and smiling. The district implemented a free lunch program last week. Ms. Thompson smiled, partly because of what we learned from Sarah. No child will go hungry here again. Robert's phone buzzed. A reminder about his interview. He ignored it. Mr. Johnson? A small voice called from behind them. A boy stood in the hallway, shifting nervously. Robert recognized him from the board meeting photos. Tommy, one of the bullies. What do you want? Robert's voice was hard. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to tell Sarah I'm sorry. For real, not just in the letter. She gave me half her lunch once when I forgot mine. Even after what I did, Robert's anger cracked. You hurt my daughter. I know. Tommy wiped his eyes. My dad, he says mean things at home. About people who are different. But Sarah was nice to me anyway. Even when I wasn't nice to her. Miss Thompson touched Robert's arm again. Tommy's in counseling now. With his whole family. Robert looked at the boy, really looked at him. Shabby clothes. 2 small shoes. Hunger in his eyes that had nothing to do with food. Sarah taught me something, Tommy whispered. About being kind, even when it's hard. Through the classroom window, Sarah laughed at something Jessica said. The sound carried into the hallway, bright and real. You can apologize to her. Robert's voice was rough, but only if she wants to hear it. And only if you mean it. Tommy nodded frantically. I do. I really do. Go on then. The boy shuffled into the classroom. Robert watched through the window as he approached Sarah's desk. Watched his daughter's face change from fear to surprise to something softer. She's extraordinary. Miss Thompson's voice was quiet. You've raised an incredible young woman. Robert couldn't speak. His eyes burned. His phone buzzed again. The clinic. Interview delayed. Construction on Main Street. I should go. He cleared his throat. Sarah, we'll be fine. Miss Thompson smiled. We have a new security system. New monitors at recess. And she gestured to the classroom. Sarah was showing Tommy her pencil case now. Jessica watched cautiously, but there was no tension in the scene. Just children learning to be better. Daddy, Sarah called. Can you come see my new desk? Robert stepped back into the classroom. The morning sun streamed through the windows, painting everything in gentle light. Sarah's desk had her name on it, decorated with stars. A small sign read, Kindness Ambassador. Something new the school had started. Look, Sarah pointed to her lunchbox. Miss Thompson says we all get free lunch now. I can still share if I want to, but nobody has to be hungry. Robert knelt beside her desk. I'm so proud of you, baby girl. Why? Sarah looked genuinely puzzled. I just share my food because... Robert touched her cheek gently. You saw people hurting, and you helped them, even when they hurt you back. Sarah shrugged, embarrassed. That's what you do at the hospital. Help people even when they're mean because they're scared or hurt. Robert's phone buzzed a third time. He pulled it out, ready to cancel the interview. A text from the clinic director. Heard about your daughter. The position includes flexible hours for school events. Still interested? Sarah watched him read the message. Is that about your new job? Maybe. Robert smiled. How would you feel about me working closer to your school? Sarah's eyes lit up. Really? Really? He hugged her tight. But right now it's time for class to start. Miss Thompson was already writing the day's schedule on the board. Jessica had saved half her breakfast muffin for Sarah. Tommy sat quietly at his desk, a new notebook open and ready. Have a good day, baby girl. Robert stood, his knees protesting. You too, Daddy. Sarah turned back to her desk, then paused. I love you. Love you too. The hallway was quiet as Robert walked out. Through each classroom window, he saw children learning, playing, growing. In one room, a teacher was giving a lesson on diversity. In another, students worked on posters about kindness. His daughter had done that. His brave, generous girl had sparked a change nobody saw coming. In the parking lot, Robert replied to the clinic's message. Very interested. On my way. The morning sun felt warm on his face. For the first time in months, his shoulders felt lighter, his steps sure. Sometimes the biggest changes came from the smallest acts of kindness. Sometimes the best teachers were the ones who still had everything to learn. His daughter had taught him that. The community center's meeting room buzzed with voices. Robert stood at the podium, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's return to school, and tonight he would address the district-wide parent assembly. You look fine. Mrs. Martinez straightened his collar. Stop fidgeting. What if I mess this up? Robert's hands shook as he arranged his notes. These people need to hear what you have to say. Mrs. Martinez's voice was firm. All of them. The room filled quickly. Teachers, parents, administrators from every school in the district. Robert recognized some faces from the news coverage. Others were strangers, drawn by the promise of change. Sarah sat in the front row between Jessica and Tommy. Her new Kindness Ambassador badge sparkled under the fluorescent lights. 5 minutes, Mr. Johnson. Director Williams touched his shoulder. Are you ready? Robert nodded, though his stomach churned. Public speaking had never been his thing. Give him a busy ER any day over this. His phone buzzed. A text from his new supervisor at the clinic. You've got this. The whole staff is behind you. The lights dimmed. Director Williams approached the podium. Good evening. His voice echoed through the sound system. We're here tonight to discuss recent changes in our district's approach to inclusion and student welfare. But first, I'd like to introduce someone who helped us see where we were failing. Mr. Robert Johnson. The room fell silent. Robert stood, his legs surprisingly steady. Thank you. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame. I'm here to tell you a story about my daughter. Sarah smiled up at him, encouraging. Robert took a deep breath. 3 months ago, I thought I was failing as a father. Working night shifts, missing school events, barely keeping up with bills. What I didn't know was that my 8-year-old was teaching me, teaching all of us, what real strength looks like. He told them everything. The half-empty lunchbox, the cruel notes, the scraped knees and torn uniform. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about Sarah's secret acts of kindness, sharing her lunch even with those who hurt her. My daughter had every reason to be bitter. Robert's hands gripped the podium. Every reason to hate school, to hate the kids who bullied her, to hate the system that failed her. Instead, she chose kindness. The room was absolutely still. In the second row, Tommy's parents held hands, tears on their faces. But kindness isn't enough. Robert's voice hardened. We need action. Real, concrete changes to protect all our children. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation. Charts showing racial demographics in the district, bullying statistics, income disparities between schools. These numbers tell a story. Robert pointed to a particularly stark graph. A story of inequality, of silent suffering, of children falling through the cracks while we adults look the other way. More slides. Security footage from school cameras showing incidents that had been ignored. Email chains of parents begging for help. Budget reports showing cuts to counseling services. I'm not here to shame anyone. Robert softened his tone. I'm here because we can do better. We must do better. He outlined the changes already implemented. New security systems, mandatory staff training, the free lunch program, anti-bullying protocols with real consequences. But that's just the beginning. Robert clicked to his final slides. Here's what we need next. For 30 minutes, he laid out his proposal. Diversity training for all staff. Regular parent forums, a student mentorship program. Resources for families struggling with food insecurity or medical costs. I know what you're thinking. Robert managed a small smile. This sounds expensive, complicated, maybe even impossible. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. But let me ask you something. He stepped away from the podium, closer to the audience. What's the cost of doing nothing? What's the price of letting another child cry alone in their bedroom, afraid to go to school, afraid to tell anyone why? Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks. Jessica held her hand tight. My daughter taught me something profound. Robert's voice filled the room. She showed me that change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it starts with one small act of kindness. One person brave enough to stand up and say, this isn't right. He clicked to his last slide. A photo of Sarah and Jessica at lunch, sharing food with a group of kids from different backgrounds. This is what hope looks like. Robert's voice softened. This is what change looks like. One lunch table at a time, one friendship at a time, one brave choice at a time. The room erupted in applause. Sarah jumped up, running to hug him. Other parents stood, some crying, some nodding determinedly. Director Williams returned to the podium. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now, let's discuss implementation. Wait. A man stood in the back. Tommy's father. I have something to say. Robert tensed, but the man's face was open, vulnerable. My son was one of the bullies. Tommy's father's voice shook. I taught him that. With my words, my attitudes. And this little girl, he gestured to Sarah. She showed him more kindness than he deserved. More kindness than I've shown. Tommy buried his face in his hands. His mother hugged him close. I'll fund it. Tommy's father straightened. The whole program. Whatever it costs. My company will cover it. A murmur ran through the crowd. Director Williams blinked rapidly. Mr. Thompson, that's very generous. It's not generosity. Tommy's father's voice was rough. It's justice. It's making things right. Sarah tugged Robert's sleeve. Does this mean it worked? Things will get better. Robert lifted her into his arms, ignoring the formal setting. Yeah, baby girl, things are already getting better. The meeting continued late into the night. Parents offered resources, teachers volunteered time, administrators revised policies on the spot. Robert sat with Sarah in his lap, watching change happen in real time. His phone buzzed one last time. A text from the clinic. Speech was amazing. Saw it live-streamed. The hospital board wants to discuss implementing similar programs in pediatrics. Interested? Sarah read the message over his shoulder. You should do it, Daddy. Help more kids. Robert hugged her tight. When did you get so wise? I learned from you. Sarah yawned, snuggling closer. You always help people, even when it's hard. The meeting wound down. Parents lingered, talking in small groups. Tommy's father shook Robert's hand, tears in his eyes. Director Williams discussed logistics with the board. Change was coming. Not perfect, not complete, but real. As they drove home, Sarah fell asleep in the back seat. Robert watched her in the rearview mirror, peaceful under the passing streetlights. Sometimes the biggest changes started small, with a shared lunch, a kind word, a father learning wisdom from his 8-year-old daughter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, driving home under stars that seemed brighter somehow, Robert felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The clinic waiting room looked different with children's artwork on the walls. Robert adjusted his new name badge, Robert Johnson, RN, Community Outreach Coordinator, and checked the morning schedule. First school visit today? Dr. Chin asked, reviewing charts beside him. Yeah. Robert straightened a drawing Sarah had made for his office. East Elementary's launching their medical education program. 1 month after the district assembly, changes were spreading faster than anyone had expected. Tommy's father had kept his word, funding not just school programs but community initiatives too. Daddy, Sarah's voice carried through the clinic doors. We're going to be late. Robert grinned. Since starting his new position, with hours that matched Sarah's school schedule, mornings had become their special time. Coming, baby girl? He gathered his presentation materials. Ready to be my assistant today? Sarah bounced on her toes, her kindness ambassador badge pinned proudly to her new uniform. No more torn clothes or scuffed shoes. No more half-empty lunchbox. The drive to school was filled with Sarah's chatter about the new programs. Jessica's mom is teaching Korean cooking in culture class, and Tommy's helping with a buddy system for new kids. And Ms. Thompson says, "Breathe, sweetheart." Robert laughed, turning into the school parking lot. The building had transformed in the past month. New security cameras gleamed discreetly. The playground equipment shone with fresh paint. A garden bloomed where bare dirt had been, tended by students and parents together. Mr. Johnson. Miss Thompson met them at the door. The assemblies all set up. The gymnasium filled quickly with students. Robert recognized faces from Sarah's stories, not just Jessica and Tommy now, but dozens of kids who'd been touched by the changes. Ready? He squeezed Sarah's hand. She nodded, clutching her part of the presentation. They'd practiced all week. Good morning, everyone. Robert's voice carried easily now. No more fear of public speaking. Who here wants to learn about what nurses do? Hands shot up across the gymnasium. In the front row, Jessica waved enthusiastically. Well, you're in luck. Robert pulled out his stethoscope. Because today, we're all going to be nurses. For the next hour, he taught basic first aid. How to clean a scrape. When to tell an adult about feeling sick. Why washing hands mattered. The kids practiced with bandages and gauze, giggling as they wrapped each other's pretend injuries. And now, Robert nodded to Sarah. My assistant has something special to share. Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. Sometimes people get hurt on the inside, too. Not where you can see with a bandage. That's why we started Friendship First Aid. She held up a poster showing simple ways to help someone feeling sad or scared. Ask if they're okay. Sit with them at lunch. Tell a trusted adult if something seems wrong. Because kindness, Sarah smiled at Tommy in the audience, is the best medicine of all. The assembly ended with students practicing their new skills. Robert watched Sarah move among her classmates, showing them how to be gentle, how to listen, how to help. His phone buzzed. A text from the hospital board. Program approved for pediatrics. When can you start training our staff? Mr. Johnson? Tommy approached, holding his practice bandage. Can I tell you something? Of course. My dad. Tommy twisted the bandage in his hands. He's different now. He says you and Sarah taught him stuff about being better. Robert knelt to the boy's level. People can change, Tommy. Just like you did. Yeah. Tommy smiled shyly. Sarah says everyone deserves a second chance. The gymnasium slowly emptied. Ms. Thompson coordinated parents who'd come to help with the new after-school programs. Jessica's mother set up her cooking demonstration in the cafeteria. Daddy? Sarah tugged his sleeve. Can we stay for Korean cooking class? Sure, baby. Robert sent a quick text to the hospital board. Happy to help. Let's change things together. The cafeteria smelled amazing. Jessica's mother showed kids how to roll kimbap, explaining the significance of sharing food in Korean culture. Parents and children worked side by side, learning and laughing together. Remember when this room was scary? Sarah whispered, helping Jessica with her roll. Robert remembered. The half-eaten lunches, the cruel notes, the silent suffering. Now the cafeteria buzzed with life. The free lunch program meant no child went hungry. Tables were mixed, no more racial or social divisions. A buddy bench near the window gave kids a place to find friends. Mr. Johnson? The school secretary appeared. There's a call for you from the superintendent's office. They want to expand the program district-wide. Sarah beamed up at him. See? I told you it would work. You sure did, baby girl. Robert touched her cheek gently. You showed us all the way. The afternoon flew by. Robert met with teachers about incorporating health education into their curricula. He coordinated with school nurses across the district. He answered emails from other schools wanting to implement similar programs at 3 o'clock. Sarah appeared in his temporary office. Homework already done during study hall. Ready to go home? She shook her head. Can we help with the garden first? Mrs. Martinez brought new plants. The school garden had become a symbol of their changes. Everything from vegetables for the cafeteria to flowers chosen by the students. A place where everyone could contribute, everyone could grow. Robert rolled up his sleeves. Lead the way, baby girl. They worked until sunset, planting and watering alongside other families. Tommy and his father built a new bench. Jessica's mother shared traditional Korean gardening techniques. Mrs. Martinez taught kids the Spanish names for different plants. Look, Daddy. Sarah pointed to a tiny sprout pushing through the soil. It's growing, just like you. Robert brushed dirt from her cheek. Just like all of us. His phone buzzed one last time. Director Williams. Board meeting tomorrow. Ready to share our success story? Sarah read the message over his shoulder. Can I come too? I want to tell them about friendship first aid. Of course. Robert saved the message. This is your story too. Maybe the most important part. They drove home under a sky painted orange and pink. Sarah hummed along with the radio, soil still under her fingernails, contentment radiating from her smile. The apartment felt different now. Photos of their new extended school family joined the old ones on the walls. Sarah's artwork covered the fridge. No more cruel notes, only pictures of friendship and hope. Daddy? Sarah asked over dinner. Are you happy with your new job? Robert considered the question. No more night shifts. No more missing important moments. Less money, maybe, but more time with his daughter. More chances to make real change. Yeah, baby girl? He smiled. I'm happy. Are you? Sarah nodded, then got quiet. Do you think Mama would be proud of what we did? Robert's heart squeezed. I think anyone would be proud of you, Sarah. You changed things. Made them better. Not just for yourself, but for everyone. We did it together. Sarah hugged him tight. That's what you always say at the hospital. Together is better. Outside, the garden they'd helped plant caught the last rays of sunset. Inside, their little apartment felt fuller somehow. Not with things, but with possibility. With hope. Change, Robert had learned, wasn't always big and dramatic. Sometimes it grew slowly, like a tiny sprout pushing through soil. Sometimes it started with one small act of kindness, one shared lunch, one brave child refusing to let hatred win. Sometimes it started with love. The end-of-year assembly buzzed with excitement. 6 months had passed since that first district meeting, and Sacramento East Elementary looked like a different school. Robert sat in the audience, watching Sarah adjust her valedictorian sash. "Can you believe it?" Mrs. Martinez whispered beside him. "From C's and D's to top of her class." Robert touched the tissue in his pocket. He'd promised himself he wouldn't cry, but seeing Sarah on stage, confident and glowing, made his eyes water anyway. "Daddy." Sarah waved from behind the podium. "Take a picture." He raised his phone, capturing her proud smile. No more haunted eyes or hunched shoulders. No more half-empty lunchbox or torn uniforms. And now, Principal Chun, formerly Director Williams, before his promotion, announced our student speaker, Sarah Johnson, will share her thoughts on our year of change. The audience applauded. Robert saw familiar faces everywhere. Jessica and her mother, Tommy and his parents, teachers who'd embraced the new programs, families who'd become part of their extended community. Sarah stepped to the microphone, her kindness ambassador badge gleaming. "Last year," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I was afraid to come to school. I felt different, alone, like I didn't belong." The room went quiet. Even the youngest students seemed to understand the importance of this moment. But then something changed. Not just rules or programs, though those helped. What really changed was how we saw each other, how we helped each other, how we learned that everyone has something to give, even if they seem different at first. Robert's throat tightened. On stage, Sarah stood straighter, her voice gaining confidence. "My daddy taught me that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about kindness, about seeing someone hurting and choosing to help. That's why our friendship first aid program worked, because we all learned to be healers." Jessica wiped tears from her eyes. Tommy sat with his father, both of them nodding. "Look around," Sarah continued. "See our garden? It grows food for anyone who needs it. Our buddy bench? No one sits alone anymore. Our culture classes? We learn something new every day about each other." She held up a thick envelope. "This is a letter from another school in Texas. They want to know how we did it, how we changed things. And you know what I'm going to tell them?" The audience leaned forward. "I'll tell them it starts with one person being brave. One lunch shared. One hand held out to someone who's hurting, even if that person hurt you first." Robert couldn't stop the tears now. 6 months ago, his daughter had been crying in her bedroom, terrified and alone. Now she stood on stage, teaching others about courage and change. "My mama left us when I was little," Sarah's voice softened. "And for a long time, I thought that meant something was wrong with me. But this year taught me different. Family isn't just who you're born to. It's who chooses to stand with you." Mrs. Martinez squeezed Robert's hand. Around them, other parents dabbed at their eyes. So if you're watching this video later, Sarah smiled at the camera streaming the event. If you're another school wondering how to change things, remember it starts with you. With one small act of kindness. With believing things can be better. She gestured to the audience. "Stand up if you've ever used friendship first aid." Almost everyone rose. "Stand up if you've helped in our garden." More people stood. "Stand up if you've made a new friend this year, someone different from you." By now, the entire audience was standing. Robert saw what Sarah had created, a room full of people connected by choice, by effort, by hope. "That's how we did it." Sarah's voice filled the room. "Together. And if we can do it, anyone can." The applause was deafening. Sarah beamed, then ran straight into Robert's arms. "Was it okay, Daddy?" "Perfect, baby girl." He held her tight. "Absolutely perfect." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Awards were given: Sarah's straight A's, the Garden Club's community service recognition, the district's implementation grant for expanding their programs afterward. Families lingered in the decorated gymnasium. Jessica's mother served Korean desserts. Tommy's father discussed funding for next year's initiatives. Mrs. Martinez showed off photos of the garden's first harvest. "Mr. Johnson?" A woman approached, holding a folder. "I'm from the Department of Education. We'd like to feature your school's transformation in a national study." Before Robert could answer, his phone buzzed. He checked the message, then froze. "What is it, Daddy?" Sarah peered at the screen. It's from your mama." Sarah went very still. "What does she want?" Robert read the message again. She saw the live stream. "She wants to talk." "Oh." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she's proud of me?" Anyone would be proud of you. Robert knelt to her level. But you don't have to talk to her if you don't want to. Sarah considered this. Maybe later. Right now, we have the celebration dinner at Jessica's house. And tomorrow we're helping Tommy's dad set up the new computer lab. And next week, I get it? Robert smiled, deleting the message. Family is who chooses to stand with you, right? Right? Sarah hugged him tight. And you always stand with me. They walked home together through the school garden. The tiny sprout Sarah had planted months ago now bloomed, its flowers reaching toward the sky. Look how tall it grew, Sarah pointed. Just like you. Robert squeezed her hand. His phone buzzed again. More messages about expanding the program, requests for interviews, offers to speak at conferences. Important things, world-changing things, but not as important as this moment. Walking through a garden his daughter helped grow, listening to her chatter about tomorrow's plans, feeling the warmth of the life they'd built together. Sometimes the biggest changes started small, with a half-empty lunchbox, with a father's love, with an 8-year-old girl brave enough to choose kindness over fear. Ready to go home? Robert asked. Sarah looked around at her school, at the garden she'd helped plant, the friends she'd helped make, the community she'd helped build. We are home, Daddy. She smiled up at him. Everywhere we help people is home. Robert lifted her onto his shoulders, her laughter ringing clear and bright in the evening air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new chances to make things better. But today, walking home with his daughter under a sky full of promise, Robert knew one thing for certain. Love, like kindness, grew best when shared. And his brave, beautiful girl had taught him how to share both.